thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. As a bit of background, I saw a YouTube a couple of months ago in the summertime. A colleague of our speaker, Kyle Strickland, made himself available with a Zoom call. He just wanted to be accessible. He wanted to, as a Black man, answer any questions that Black people and white people might have and just be a resource. He thought he would have maybe a couple dozen people tune in and that maybe it would go 30 minutes. It ended up being 1,000 people, 1,000 viewers, and the chat box went for almost 3 hours. He answered questions. So we thought it would be great to have access like that for us. In fact, that guy, was on the Today Show after that. The video went viral and it was a big deal. So we've got his colleague today, who's also very astute and well-versed in service and at the same employer and involved in the same thing. So I wanted to let you know that today we're going to have Rotarian questions. These are questions that you all have sent us ahead of time, and I'll be interviewing him. And if you haven't seen his bio yet, Kyle Strickland is Senior Legal Analyst and Special Assistant to the Director at the Kirwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Kyle's research focuses on issues related to race and the criminal justice system, civic engagement, and education policy. In addition, Mr. Strickland leads the coordination of My Brother's Keeper, Ohio, a statewide network that helps provide educational and community opportunities for boys and young men of color. Kyle graduated from OSU with a bachelor's in political science and then earned his law degree from Harvard Law School, where he also served as president of the student body. So I'd like to begin with just a backdrop of what's going on in this country right now. There's been racial violence for generations, but I don't recall any time in my life when corporate America, professional sports organizations, private and public organizations, including the Rotary Club of Columbus, have made it a top priority to make a statement about embracing equality and condemning racism. Corporations are looking for candidates to hire as their diversity and inclusion officers. Human resource manuals are being rewritten to reflect these values. So the events of this summer have had quite an impact, and people now are willing to have uncomfortable conversations. So before we get to the questions from the Rotarians, Kyle Strickland, would you like to just say a few words, give us an overview of your work and where we are in this moment?
Of course. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you, Scott. Thank you to the entire organization here and all of you for joining. Thanks so much for having me, for those who are tuning in. I think what's important right now, the moment that we're in, is for us to be able to kind of level set and recognize that the times we're in are not normal times, right? I mean, these times are not normal. In the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a reckoning with racial justice in this country, and the questions are really going to come down to, how do we move forward? What does that look like as we move forward as a country, as a society, as community, and then as individuals? What is it that we can do to change things? Because too often there has been a narrative, especially when it comes to race in this country, about how we can, what does it actually look like when we move forward together? Some people make the argument, well, let's not talk about race. If you talk about race, it's divisive, it's controversial. However, I would argue that not talking about race is actually ignoring the lived experiences of so many people. And if we ignore those experiences, if we don't talk the truth about these experiences, then what that will result is that vacuum of us not talking about it will be filled with the loudest voices that might be done to divide and use as a wedge for others, so that it actually is in fact divisive for us to not talk about it. We have to lean into these discussions and these conversations. We have to learn and kind of recognize within our own awarenesses about what is it that we can do as individuals and as communities to address racial disparities more broadly. And it's something that all of us have a role to play in, regardless of our backgrounds. And so a lot of the work I do at the Kirwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, it's a mix of research, policy, and community engagement. It's looking at things like implicit bias, the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that we might hold at an interpersonal level, but it's also looking at things like systemic racism, which we'll talk about a little later, which is the history of our country's laws, policies, practices, and to how that has led to disparities that we see today. And all those merge into understanding that the problems, the inequality that we see is a result of structures and systems over time that have perpetuated a gap of disparities between people of all backgrounds, but especially when it comes to that fault line of race in America. So I'm just excited to be here for this conversation. It's an important conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but the willingness of your organization to really step up and have this discussion is critical, and I'm grateful for the conversation.
Great, and that's really leads to our first question, which is, we're all familiar with the word racism, but now the words used are systemic racism. Can you share some examples of where our systems promote racism?
Of course. So, there's a lot of discussion about racism, and people can typically call that out or see what it is. When an individual uses racial slurs or the KKK or these prominent hate groups that people see as those who believe that their one race is inferior to the other race, right? And we hear about that often. You see less explicit, still you see it, but you see less explicit forms of that today. But what is often overlooked is this idea around systemic racism, right? So that basically is, it doesn't even have to necessarily be intentional, right? But policies, discriminatory policies, laws that were implemented in the past have ongoing disparities that contribute to inequality today. So for instance, we can think about things like redlining. So these were intentional policies that were implemented that said that banks were going to deny loans for Black people to be able to obtain a loan to be able to get a home in a certain area of the neighborhood and the community. And so what ended up happening then was you saw all sorts of racial segregation and economic segregation. And so certain people could only live in certain aspects of a community. And so that redlining meant that Black people, brown people were cut off from opportunities to buy a home, to be able to build wealth over time and to pass that down from generation to generation. And those disparities from those policies contribute and trickle to where we are today. And all of that has an underlying theory of really trying to confer benefits and advantages for one group. And in many cases, it used to be from the very beginning, white males, predominantly white males, at the disadvantage of other groups, which tend to be Black and brown communities, and especially with race in America, that has been kind of the fault line and through line in our country. But what that means then is that all of these policies that were intentionally discriminatory in the past have now lingering effects. And so it goes into our criminal justice system. So now we know today that Black communities are more likely to be arrested, incarcerated, sent to prison longer than their white counterparts, even if they were committing the same crime, right? And we see these types of disparities over and over again, and it's how the systems perpetuate disparities over time. And so we have to recognize those policies, even if they're unintentional and they have unintentional consequences today, we have to reverse some of those trends and to confront those head on. And so it affects every single sector we're in. When you see disparities in education, when you see disparities in our criminal justice system, all of that is the result of a history of advantage for some and disadvantage for others.
Okay. Next question from Rotarians is, some people believe there would be more traction and buy-in for the Black Lives Matter movement if it were changed to an All Lives Matter movement. What are your thoughts about that?
So I disagree. So and here's why. So the premise behind the movement for Black Lives is this idea that for too long, as a society, our actions have not met up with our supposed values, right? And this idea that all people are created equal regardless of background, regardless of skin color. And yet, the way that our society treats certain people has not been that way. And because of the historic experience, the Black experience in America, the Black Lives Matter movement was especially an outgrowth. It really kind of came out after the killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, and consistent cases where you see police brutality, police killings of Black men and Black people in America. And it really came out to this idea of, we are trying to say that Black Lives Matter because in a society, it doesn't seem like our society believes in that. And so we need people who can stand up, speak truth to power, and say Black Lives Matter. And it's really a clarion call for all of us to step up and to be able to declare that phrase. And there have been those who will say, well, I believe that all lives matter, right? As a response for Black Lives Matter. But here's the thing. The notion behind Black Lives Matter is it is implied that all lives also matter. However, in this current moment, all lives cannot matter until Black lives do. And so the reason we have this phrasing about Black Lives Matter is because we should be able to say that, especially right now with the exploitation, the oppression that we see, even if you may not know what that experience is like, this is a moment for us to listen, to have the voices heard of those who have been denied for so long and who are trying to claim that we've got to be able to say Black Lives Matter. And so the reason why I think it's important to not just say, oh, let's just all come together, is because that's ignoring the truth. And that's ignoring kind of how things look in our society. The facts are that things are not equal. You know, just things are not equal. And that doesn't have to do with any one person necessarily. But what it does say is that our society values certain lives more than others. And you know, this can go across the range of just race. This talk about how we view those who are in poverty, how we view those based on their identity. And what we've seen are those with marginalized identities continue to be marginalized in our society. And so this is an opportunity for these groups to stand up and talk about these issues. So for example, you think about things like Black History Month. Some people say, well, you know, why do we need a Black History Month? Why, you know, why not a White History Month, or why not have every set of months differently? The idea is that the Black experience in this country has been ignored or pushed aside for the vast majority of our history. And so this is an opportunity to celebrate, to speak out, and to talk about the collective liberation and opportunities for Black and brown communities specifically.
Okay, thank you. Another one is, because single parents seem to be more common in families of color, should people read anything into that? Some people are concerned that our current welfare and benefit system encourage single family households. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's a common misconception. So the idea is this. So certainly, without a doubt, what we see in a lot of communities are single parent households, but you also see you might have additional guardians, so familial support that can play a role in households. There's a lot of reasons for that. So one, as I mentioned from the very beginning, this is rooted in a lot of structural barriers and structural factors. We look at things like from all the way from redlining, discrimination, segregation, and to where we are today, and even in the 80s around the war on drugs, where people were locked up for minor drug offenses that they wouldn't be today, or that they shouldn't necessarily be today, because we frame it as a public health issue. We focus on the needs and disparities. And so as a country, what we have done then, because of our history, there have been concentrated pockets of Black and brown communities tend to be concentrated in lower income communities. Doesn't mean they're all in lower income communities, which is another misconception that some people have. But because of these disparities, they tend to make up the larger share as it relates to their group in these types of households. However, it's also important to keep in mind that there are still a vast majority of people, whites, Blacks, Latinx, of all backgrounds, that are from single parent households and single parent homes for a variety of different reasons. And it's not only a lack of personal responsibility type of thing that happens. There's a lot of factors that come into it. But one of the pieces there is precisely because our system, our social safety net, is vastly under-resourced. It just is vastly under-resourced. And so as a result, people don't have the support systems that they need to be able to thrive. And so, for example, if you have a single parent household and you've got to work 2 or 3 jobs and you also have to send your kids to school, you're going to have time. It's going to be a hard time to do. If you don't have access to childcare, there's all these other support systems that we have. And unfortunately, the narrative hasn't been government should provide more assistance and opportunities and pathway for people in need. The narrative has basically been, you're on your own. The idea that you're making, you're trying to game the system. You had narratives like welfare queen and all sorts of things like that, where the idea was that somehow you're gaming the system. You're just trying to make money off of the welfare and the benefit system, and there's no incentives for you to work. And that couldn't be further from the truth. While there are certainly circumstances in which there are those who might try to do what they can to navigate the system, the vast majority of people, on welfare and on the benefits, if they can, they work. And so this idea is that, somehow people are lazy or they don't work hard enough because they have to receive benefits because they're in need. It ignores and omits the systemic and structural factors. And so in order to deal with the issues of providing more supports for whether it's single parent households or those in need, we actually need to bolster our social safety net in our benefit system to ensure that more people have access to opportunities. We need to do things like raising wages for people, and so that they don't just have to, because you can't just make ends meet only on benefits. You also have to work. You also have to be able to be a part of a larger community to do that. So I think it's important for us to recognize that a benefit and support system is done not just as a handout, but a hand up. How can we provide the support that people need to get to the next level?
Okay. Assuming that attitudes and biases developed in children come from their parents and family, what would you recommend K through 12 schools do or teach to minimize or neutralize the biases handed down from generation to generation of both whites and people of color?
That's a great question. We've got to talk about our history, and we've got to talk about it in an honest way. I think a lot of us kind of hear our history of what happened and kind of pave over the uglier aspects of our history. And we don't like to talk about a whole lot, right? Because we like to say, well, that happened in the past. Let's move on. Let's talk about the good things. And the idea is that America, especially when we talk about American history, is that it's been like a straight line of progress. So you talk about overcoming slavery and Jim Crow, and you had the civil rights movement, and we're moving along and we're progressing along. And yet our history is a lot more complicated than that. The facts are that the history of slavery and discrimination, that was brutal. That was a brutal history that we don't talk about a lot because it's a traumatic history. It's an ugly sin of our past. And there's an idea among some that say, well, let's not just get bogged down in our history. Let's talk about how we can move forward as a country. Here's the thing. We will never move forward as a country if we fail to reckon with our legacy of slavery, of discrimination, and its ongoing effects of where we are today. And people might say, well, at what point what do you mean reckoning with your legacy? How often do we need to bring up the past? Quote, bring up the past. Here's the thing. Our past is part of American history, both the bad and the good. We will look back to our founding ideals when we look at our nostalgic moments of our history. But we also have to look back on those ugly moments so we can learn from the past, the sins of the past, and how those create disparities. Because here's the thing. There's an ideology that persists and exists that had that ideology of thinking that other people, based on the color of their skin, were inferior to others. And so as a result, that ideology of white supremacy and thinking that they could enslave other people for their own personal gains and political profits and personal interests. That ideology still exists today among some. It's not nearly as intense as it was then, but it still exists where people believe that the only way America is going to be best off is if entire races separate from one another. And because of people thinking about superiority and inferiority, all of these things. And we've got to move on from that. We've got to teach our history and say that we can learn from these lessons of the past. And here's why. Because the inequality, the despair that we see today in our current moment, there are some people who see that inequality and say, well, that's just because people have personal deficits or group flaws, and that's a problem of their own making. And then there are other narratives that I like to point to, which is there is the idea of systems and structures combined with interpersonal factors that actually keep people from thriving, right? That keep people, and not only keep people from thriving, but also have exploited people and have extracted from communities. And those disparities are lingering. And until we reckon with that history and how its effects on where we are today, we're not going to get to the type of equality that we need to see in our country.
Okay. Do you think the federal government should do more to incentivize cultural change within police departments in order to improve racial justice?
So, sir, I think the federal government and all actors need to play a role in incentivizing not only conversations, but also policy change on the climate of any organization. So whether it's in the police department or whether it's in a school district, right, where you need to talk about these histories. And, it's not as if any of this is happening in a vacuum. I mean, right now we have a federal government has made it a priority to not talk about these issues, because the idea that is an executive order that was issued that somehow anti-racism trainings or conversations about racism is anti-American. I've got news for a lot of folks. This same type of narrative of anti-American, talking about our history, this has been used all throughout our history. So, for example, when we talk about expand, in the moment we're in now, expanding democracy, making democracy more inclusive for all people, there's this idea that somehow any sort of criticism of your country is all of a sudden anti-American. And yet, that's one of the most American and patriotic things you can do, to say that we have problems here, but we love our country so much that we are going to do what we can to address some of these disparities moving forward. And so as a federal government, it shouldn't be up to the federal government to try to be dictating what people are doing in their schools or doing it necessarily in the police departments. But what we should be doing is providing opportunities and a structure of accountability. If you have a climate of discrimination and racism and a lack of accountability in your own police department or in your own communities, you need to address it. And that has to be addressed through policy change. It has to be addressed to reforming these practices so you rid these systematic abuses over time. And so I think the federal government certainly has a role to play in that as well.
Some Americans, some white Americans are concerned not with just police brutality against African Americans, but also violence within predominantly Black communities. Do you believe the suggestions of defunding the police could increase violence in African American communities?
Yeah, so I would challenge a little bit the premise of the question. So there's a couple of things here, right? So one is that the idea, I think, in our country for a long time has been that the answer to any sort of thing that has to do with safety, community safety, is immediately calling the police. And I think the conversations that we've had over the last few months, over the last year, and for others who have been having this conversation as a while, is that there's a whole lot of other things that come into this idea of community safety. It means, what are we doing to provide healing and reimagine what community safety look like? It doesn't necessarily mean police every time. In fact, in many cases and situations, it might mean having a social worker involved, having somebody who's a medical health professional involved to deal with a lot of these issues. The idea is that we have to get to the root of a lot of these societal ills, and we can't simply police our way out of the problem. And so when it comes to violence in communities, there's a whole host of reasons that occurs. But one of the issues that we also have to deal with is some of the economic factors, right? So there are some communities that have combining factors of struggling economically, not getting the same investments, not getting the same resources as other communities. You also have some communities that are hyper surveilled. So you have over surveillance, hyper surveillance of these communities. And so what ends up happening is that when you might have more and more police interactions, those could offer opportunities where disparities and disputes arise when perhaps that didn't need to happen in the first place. And the reason why I point to that is because there's a lot of ways to solve our problems without involving the police. That doesn't necessarily mean anybody is anti-police. It just means we are asking a lot of police departments to deal with societal ills and challenges that need to be addressed through policy, need to be addressed through government, need to be addressed through different sectors that can play a role. And I think as communities, we can play a role. We have to strengthen the fabric of our communities. We have to connect disconnected people who have been disconnected, who have been left behind because they don't have the same access to resources, and perhaps violence is something that they might get caught up into. But we have to look at these factors at the root. And until we do that, we're not going to get to where we need to be. There are other alternatives. We have to think about alternatives to just incarceration. We can't police our way out of a problem. We can't lock people up out of our problem, because that has not worked, right? So we have to address some of these other issues. What would it look like if we actually funded our schools, our education systems, and make sure everybody had access to a living wage job, make sure that everybody has access to healthcare and high quality infrastructure? What would that community look like? You wouldn't see nearly as high rates as crime and poverty in these areas if we invested in those things. Oops, I think Kathleen might have fell off. No worries. I will answer the other question in the chat while we get Kathleen. There was a question about if I work with Chris Sewell. So I do. So he's fantastic. He does the work with My Brother's Keeper, specifically here in Columbus. So I do the statewide work, and then we engage with him in the Department of Neighborhoods in the city of Columbus. They do a lot of incredible work. A lot of their goals are around economic and educational and community mental health. So on the educational side, it's how do we make sure that, well, now in the COVID era, it's how do we make sure that our young people are getting connected to learning opportunities, especially virtual learning opportunities in the current moment. And then also long-term, third grade reading level, if you're of that age range, as well as high school graduation is a big focus. And then for our older youth who are going into college or other opportunities, it's college visits, those types of things to get them engaged. And on the economic front, it's how can we connect those who are eligible to the workforce? So whether that's through internships or actual jobs and opportunities over the long run. So those are some of the pieces that we focus on. And the mental health and community supports is something that we focus on as well. Yeah, I don't know. Did Kathleen join? Yep.
I had a question. I'll get it in while Kathleen's getting back on board.
Perfect.
I work with the university, with Ohio State University and our Rotary Club in a mentoring program. And we're talking about possibly expanding it to a broader audience of students. And they're focusing on first generation students, particularly those who are at risk for dropping out of school because of their unfamiliarity with the experience and so forth. But I want to recount the guy who runs the program has a skin color more like yours than mine. Mm. And I said, well, if we had a group of 25 dark-skinned youth, will they value and accept and be comfortable with mentoring from people who have this late? I'm Italian, so mine's a little darker than most, but is that an issue, or is that an issue that's only in my mind because I'm thinking of the reverse problem? I mean, I have a lot of people that are friends. We don't have enough people your color in our club. We need some more people like you in our club to help us get that perspective. But the old cliche, I know how you feel. No, I don't know how you feel.
So no, that's a great question, John. So you're exactly right in terms of, I think what's important is for people to be able to identify within themselves that they see somebody who looks like them or who understands them, right? And I think being able to some mentorship relationships can be regardless of background, right? So whether it's race or gender, but I think what's important is that as a group, that you are aware of those issues. So that good on you, right? Because you should be able to recognize, look, I will not be able to understand all of your experiences, but I'm here to listen. I'm here to be supportive. and to be able to get people connected with others who might look like them, but you can still be a great mentor, and they can still see somebody who invests in them and values them regardless of their background. But what I think is important is just having that humility and awareness of, look, I may not understand what this is like, but what I want to do is I want to listen, I want to be there for you, and I want to be supportive. Without, again, with all that being said, certainly as an organization, more must be done to ensure that you have a diverse enough group that is reflective of the general population. So obviously in Columbus. So how can you continue in those spaces? That's when you start at least more of those external partnerships, getting more people involved. And so, even if you don't have people who are going to be mentors 24/7, how do you get those folks connected in the longer term? Those are things that you can do. But that's a great point, John.
Thank you.
Looks like Kathleen joined by phone.
Yep, I'm on my phone now. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So is it time, Chip, for us to hand it back to you?
Yeah, so we have time for one more question.
Okay. So I would like to ask this one then. All Rotarians, Kyle, around the world believe in the four-way test. Two of the tenets of that are, is it fair to all concerned? Is it beneficial to all concerned? So members of this club provide many service hours to help at-risk children in the Columbus City schools, many of whom are children of color. We have tried as a club, our membership committee talks about it, the board talks about it, we try to become more diverse. We want to reflect the community we serve. We try to bring candidates, they come to the meeting, they're interested enough in Rotary to come to the meeting because they're excited about what we do. After the meeting, after they see us, I guess, when we come together, we lose them. Is there something you could suggest that we do to try to help ourselves become more diverse and gain membership that reflects the community we serve?
Great, and that's a great question, similar to John's, and one of the points there. No, but it's a perfect tie-in, because one of the points that I would say is that this is an ongoing effort, right? And it has to be an ongoing effort to show and to build trust over time, because this is certainly not going to be something that with any organization that somebody can kind of see themselves in and stay apart in. This has to be a consistent outreach, continue to build partnerships, continue to hold conversations like these, because more people will tune in, listen in, and may say, oh, I didn't necessarily know what that was like. And then what can you do as individuals to reach out within your own networks to have those conversations and say, hey, look, I would love for you to be a part, or whether it's not a full-time member or what that might look like, maybe you can do a project here and there that we can partner on. And then over time, that's how you start to diversify as an organization. And then one of the last points I'll say is, as an organization, you have to look back on what are we doing that perhaps we need to be doing a better job on. And so it's not just all of the pieces of here we are, we're striving to do better. One, the first things first is recognizing that there's an issue. So I think everybody has recognized that, has seen that. And then from there, we have to say, what do those next steps look like moving forward? And I think that's on all of us to really look at, how do we build those partnerships? How do we strengthen those partnerships? How do we talk about these issues? And it requires all of us on an individual level being able to figure out the spaces that we're in and talking about these issues in a real way, an authentic way. And here's the thing, you may not get every single experience because of your background, because of your life experiences. But one of the things that we all can do is listen in and really kind of hear people's perspectives, and then challenge our own perspectives on some of these issues and say, okay, how can we do more here? Not because I'm just simply trying to learn, but because it is the right thing to do. And we have to recognize that none of this happens in a vacuum, right? And not everybody might necessarily have a specific sets of times to be able to do X, Y, or Z. So how do you work with organizations on a project-based, maybe a project basis? So it's project by project. And so people might be able to join for a short term, and then you start to build that over time, and you have longer term partnerships and engagements. And so again, conversations like these, building these projects over time, and I think you'll get there. So I'm just grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all.
Thanks, that's great. And now we will turn it back over to Chip, and I just wanted to say one more time, Kyle, thank you so much for making yourself available to us as a resource, and we appreciate the partnership with you.
Thank you so much. And you got to make sure, continue to engage people like Jasper. Jasper is fantastic. So, and thanks so much, everybody. I really do appreciate it. And look, you all know Chris Sewell. There's a lot of folks that you can continue to partner with, and let us know that, how we and myself can continue to be a resource, and we'll make sure to get it out there. But, and one of the things I didn't mention, thank you. Thank you for all you do. I think at the end of the day, some of this stuff can be thankless and you don't do it for that, but it is important to be able to recognize for the work that you do, the service that you provide for our community. It's tremendous. And we got a lot of work to do, but we need all the help we can get. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kyle. We greatly appreciate you being here today and wholeheartedly concur that still a lot of work to do. So appreciate your time today. And I want to thank Kathleen for being our moderator today as well. Thanks, Kathleen. And we are adjourned. Hope you have a great week and a happy Halloween.